long time ago. Well, actually, I was born over 150 years ago in 1844.
You look good.
Well, thank you. And my family was very well-to-do, so we got to travel a lot. And my father often took the entire family to Paris. And that's where I became very familiar with the Louvre Art Museum. And that was my first experience at seeing famous paintings, and I was absolutely fascinated with the whole thing.
That's quite an exposure. Now, you actually moved to France.
Yes, I did. I had a hard time getting there on my own. My father was not too willing to let me go off to become an artist, because no one at that time, women in society, I should say, were not artists at that time in America. And he thought that was a little too bohemian for me. But he finally agreed to it. My mother did a lot of talking, and as long as I lived with people that they knew in Paris, that was all right.
And keep in mind now, we're talking about the 1860s.
Yes.
So that was quite an ordeal for a young woman to travel abroad. So when you arrived in France, what sort of painting did you do, and who were you influenced by?
Well, my first experience was studying the famous paintings in the Louvre. And like many of the art students at that time, we learned by copying the paintings that we saw hanging on the walls. And after a while, my own style developed, and I found out that I liked painting ordinary people doing ordinary things, and mostly children.
And somewhere I read, or I may have read, that you were inspired by Degas. Is that correct?
Yes, I was. My first experience meeting him was rather strange, because he saw one of my paintings hanging in an exhibit, and he wanted to know who the Monsieur Cassatt was, because I always signed my paintings early on as M. Cassatt, and could not believe that I was a woman. And he insulted me a little at first, but we did become very good friends, and I was very much influenced by his opinion of my work.
Did you then stay in France to continue painting, or did you return to America?
I, of course, wanted to come back to let everybody at home know that I had become an artist. And when I came back, one very traumatic experience I had when I was 26, I brought most of my paintings, my very best paintings, back. And I traveled to Chicago for an exhibit in the new Palmer House Hotel. And while I was there, I noticed a glow in the sky in the distance at night. They told me there was a fire. This was in 1871. They said there was a fire in the city, but it was far away. Well, that night, at midnight, we went screaming and running out of the hotel because it was on fire, and that was the Great Chicago Fire.
Oh, my.
Lost all my paintings in that.
Oh, that's a tragedy. Now, you mentioned before we came on the air that you were also present for World War II.
At the very end, toward the end of my life, when World War II was going on in France, it was very close to where I lived outside Paris, and I had to, I was in fear of losing my paintings again, so I had to have my servants help me, and we packed them all up and wrapped them carefully and hid them in a little log cabin, or a little log house, I should say, out behind my home. And we had to flee then, but hopefully, they would be all right. And later on, we found that there was damage done to my home, but my paintings were not discovered by the enemy troops, so they were all safe and intact.
When you visit the schoolrooms, Mary, what most do you want to impart to the children?
I try to let them know that Mary became very successful because she painted the things that she liked and the things that she knew, and also that she followed her dream. If she decided that she wanted to overcome these obstacles of being one of the few women to do this sort of thing, and to just follow what you like to do.
Follow your dreams.
Yes.
You set a good example for that.
Thank you.
Also with us today is Maria Mitchell, played by Maggie Shane. Maria, you really had an interesting life, and I should be addressing you as Professor Mitchell, is that correct?
That is correct.
Well, Professor Mitchell, tell us how you got into astronomy.
Okay. Right now, I am a professor at Vassar College, a college for women that was one of the first opened in New York, and I am also the director of the observatory there. My first experience with astronomy was with my father, and on the roof of our house when I was a very little girl, about 4, we had a small 2-inch telescope that we would look at the stars with. And it was important to look at the stars when I was a child because I was born on Nantucket Island off the coast of Massachusetts. And all of our neighbors were whalers or sea captains. And the economy was pretty much ships and sailing. and my father used to set the instruments that the sea captains used for navigation. And schooling for a young girl in the early 1800s was pretty basic: math, reading, writing. But I liked to read about science and geometry and navigational skills and those type of things. So I taught myself. My entire education was from books, from reading. And I went on to be a librarian and continued to study the stars. And at 29, I discovered a comet. And it was a very important discovery, but it took quite a bit of lobbying from the men around me to get credit for it. And after that time, I became the first woman to be nominated to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and I was 30 years old.
Now let me back up a little bit here, Professor Mitchell. At the time you were studying astronomy from books, that was not a very popular time for women to be interested in the sciences. It was considered improper.
That is correct. And I worked at the library in order to help my family out financially, my parents. I never married, and I took care of my father till he died and helped my family financially. And at the time, it was nearly impossible for me to get into a college, so I never had the opportunity or the ability to get into one.
And yet you were self-taught astronomer and discovered
Correct.
a comet.
Correct.
Well, what was the comet's name?
Miss Mitchell's comet.
No surprise there. And how long did it take between the time you discovered it and the time it was actually acknowledged?
It was just a couple of months, but the night that I saw the comet, the next day a huge storm came into Nantucket and closed down all the shipping lanes. So the information did not get to the mainland in time. Other people had then seen the comet on the same night and at a later time, and so there was a lot of controversy about who had actually seen it first, and the fact that it was seen first by a woman was even more controversial. So we had some difficulty. It was very hard for me to accept the fact that it took my father and other members of my community who were men in order to get that recognition.
And again, pretty typical for that time in the
Very typical for that time.
Now, tell us about the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. You were elected to that.
Right, and that was, at the time, a group of scientists who got together for meetings just as other associations or for other types of things. But it was very difficult. I am very fearful of large groups, and walking into a room being the only woman in it is even more daunting at times. Along those lines, as I struggled through being a college professor without ever going to college, working within the administration, realizing that the men at the college made quite a bit more money than I did for the exact same job, I was one of the founders of the Association for the Advancement of Women. And at that time I was 55, and I worked with groups of women to help them aid each other in advancing whatever their goal was.
And as you visit the schools, Professor Mitchell, what is the information or the thought that you're trying to impart to the children?
Part of it is that it's okay to be a woman and be interested in math and science. Part of it is if you don't get it in school, that doesn't mean you can't teach it to yourself if you're interested in something. And that at one time in my life I was studying a comet and there was a tree in the way. So I went out and I cut it down because it was blocking my view at the observatory. And that was extended to the children as don't let obstacles be in your way when you really want to accomplish something.
Right. Well, Professor Mitchell or Maggie, thank you for joining us. Next on the program, we have Annie Smith Peck, or Annie Peck, depending on which book you're reading, played by Lisa Abrahams. Annie? Lisa? Whatever. Welcome to the show.
Why, thank you.
Now, Annie, you're particularly interesting to us mountain folk up here, and that is because you are known as a mountain climber.
That's right.
What I found interesting in reading about you is that you didn't get into this until you were 45.
That's exactly right. And thank you for letting me be here today and rest for a minute. You see, I was born back in Rhode Island, and I came from a family of 4 brothers, pretty traditional. And I was told that women, they weren't supposed to be in athletics. They were supposed to study. So I did that. As a matter of fact, I graduated from the University of Michigan with top honors and actually became a professor, one of the first women professors in the United States. But I started to travel and travel. And when I went to Switzerland and I saw the Matterhorn, the real Matterhorn, I thought to myself, I want to climb that. So I spent about 10 years climbing smaller mountains and getting myself prepared. And when I was 45, I did climb the Matterhorn. And from that point on, I decided mountain climbing is what I wanted to do. And I stopped being a professor, but I made money by talking about my climbs. As a matter of fact, I just came down from one of my most important climbs that made me world famous. And this is Mount Huascarán in the Andes of Peru. At the time, it was thought to be the highest mountain in the Americas, 22,000 feet. Now, I had tried to climb this before, 5 other times, but this was my 6th time, and I was determined to go where no other man had been, or woman. Well, we did succeed to get to the top of that climb, and many things befell us along the way. As you know, it was very cold, which is why I was dressed like this with warm woolen mittens and warm hats. Matter of fact, my boots here, as you can see, if you don't mind me resting for a minute, they're about 3 sizes too big for me. That's because we had to wear warm wool socks. We didn't have all the things they have today. We had to bring our ice axes because sometimes we had to chop the ice just to get to the top. And our ropes, which often helped us because one of our porters one day fell into a deep crevasse. We had to pull him out with our rope. He was okay. But I made it to the top of that summit, and that's what made me world famous, because I was not only the first person, but the first woman to make it to the top. The Peruvian government even named the top of that after me.
Oh, that's exciting. Annie, what year did you climb that hill?
Well, the year was in 1908, and I was 58 years old.
That is quite an accomplishment.
Thank you.
That
and
is something.
It is, and as a matter of fact, I climbed till I was 82 years old.
That in itself is an accomplishment, and especially, as you say, we didn't have Gore-Tex back then.
No, so it's a very exciting life for me.
Well, thank you for coming on the show today. I appreciate that. Joe, Maggie, and Lisa, thank you all for being on this half of the show. We will be coming back in the second half with 2 more characters. I'm sure you're going to look forward to meeting them. Again, this is being sponsored by the American Association of University Women. It's a mentor program, and they are visiting schools in the area. I've certainly enjoyed meeting you, or all 6 of you, depending on how we're going to count that. Thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you.
Welcome back to Truckee Talks. On our show today, we're featuring women in history, and coming back now with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, played by Laurie Martin. Ms. Stanton, welcome to the show, or should I say Ms. Cady Stanton?
Ms. Cady Stanton. I chose to keep my whole name, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, when I was married.
Elizabeth, let's talk a little bit about what you've accomplished in your life. Now, you were what one might call an early feminist.
Yes. Actually, I was the first of the new women, one of the first women who chose to wear more radical dress. I'd like to show you, in fact, the outfit that I have today. A friend of mine made this for me. Turkish trousers, and we named them after my friend Amelia Bloomer. Bloomers.
Now, this would have been considered pretty racy in your day.
Well, in fact, people throw sticks and stones and yell at me and my friends as we're walking through the streets in this dress. So yes, it's considered very radical because of the freedom that allows women.
Interesting. Tell me a little bit about your history, Ms. Cady Stanton. How did you get involved in this? What inspired you, and what led you through which stages in your life?
Well, I grew up in a family of 11 children. And my brothers died, and when my oldest brother died, my father was beside himself. and I curled up on my father's lap to comfort him. And he said, "Elizabeth, how I wish you were a boy." And I said to him, "Father, I will prove to you that I can be as good as any boy." And I set out to learn Greek and ride a horse and do all the things that boys were doing that women weren't allowed to do. And when I shared those accomplishments with my father, he still said, "How I wish you were a boy." So I set out for the next 50 years of my life to prove that I could be as good as any man.
Without having to be a man.
Yes. And my father was a lawyer. I used to visit his office and hear the stories of women whose husbands had died or whose fathers had died, and women weren't allowed to have any property or money of their own. And I felt that this should be unlawful and illegal. And I told my father I would cut the pages out of the law books that had these awful laws for women. And of course he laughed and said, "Elizabeth, you're not going to change the law by cutting the pages out of the law books." And I said, "Well, how am I going to make changes for women?" And he said, "Women must be able to vote to change these laws."
Mm-hmm. The suffrage movement, as it was known. Now, you were associated with Susan B. Anthony, whose name may be better known, but perhaps her work wasn't any more difficult. Or how did you two get to know each other, and what sort of work did you do together?
Actually, I met Susan B. Anthony in 1851, just after I adopted this Turkish trouser dress. And Susan and I went on the road. It was after the Women's Rights Convention, where we developed the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments for Women, where we came up with a document that said, "All men and women are created equal." And Susan and I went on the road carrying this message and speaking to groups of men and women all over the country, and working toward the movement of helping women be able to vote.
And you also were involved with a suffrage association. You created, or?
Yes, actually, Susan and I agreed and disagreed on certain issues, and at times one or the other of us was more radical, and there were two different groups. First of all, during those days, there was the abolitionist movement, which was for the freedom of slaves, of course, before the Civil War. And some women tried to tie the issue of women's rights into that movement, rights for all. And other movements were focused just on women's rights. So there were many different groups actually coming just out of the Civil War working on human rights and women's rights.
And as you visit the classrooms, Elizabeth, what information or what message is most important to you to impart to the children that you're visiting?
Well, the message I would like to get across is, one, how long it took women be able to receive the right to vote from the time of the Declaration of Independence until after my death in 1920, when actually the amendment was passed to the Constitution that allowed women to vote. That it was a long, hard struggle, and women were often not supported in this movement.
And perhaps for the young women that you're visiting to not take that vote for granted and to go out and exercise and use it.
Right.
Okay. Thank you for visiting. We'll be back with you in just a few
Thank you.
minutes. Our next guest is Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, played by Sal Bulkley. Welcome.
Hello.
Justice O'Connor, you were the first woman appointed to the Supreme Court of the United States.
Yes, in 1981. Actually, I was the youngest person on the court, too, in addition to being the first woman. And the 102nd person appointed to the court. President Reagan had promised the women of our country that he would appoint a woman, and not only my family and friends were proud and delighted, but women everywhere thought it was high time that a woman serve on the highest court in our country.
Hear, hear. Now, the previous guests that we've had on the show have been from earlier eras. Sandra Day O'Connor is still alive and still serving on the Supreme Court.
Oh, yes.
And it's somewhat amazing to me that in my lifetime was when a woman was appointed to the Supreme Court and not previous to that. But it certainly is an accomplishment I applaud. Tell me a little bit about your background before being appointed to the Supreme Court. I understand you were an assistant attorney general.
Yes, that was my first job in California. Now, I have to back up a little bit. Decided to women in law school. In fact, I was accepted, but it turned out I was one of 7 women in a class of 150, and that's about 1 or 2 girls in the average elementary school class in Truckee. I wasn't afraid to speak up in class. I got along very well with everybody. And I found it very exciting and very stimulating. I loved to read. I was a good student. And I enjoyed the law very much.
So you kept pursuing that.
Mm-hmm.
And how did you get involved in the political light, and how did President Reagan come to recognize you for appointment?
Well, he called me a judge for all seasons. And I kind of treasure that comment. They did a search for a woman to be on the Supreme Court. And I remember the day he called me. It was perhaps one of the most exciting days of my life. The secretaries in my office were joking. They said, maybe it will be you. Maybe you will be nominated. I said, no, that will never happen. But I was, and we talked on the phone. He asked some very hard questions about what kind of judge I would be on the Supreme Court. But then we found we had a common interest. I grew up on a cattle ranch called the Lazy Bee in Arizona, and President Reagan had a ranch and was a fine horseman. So we ended up swapping stories about horses and cattle drives, and I kind of like to think that maybe that helped him decide I was the right person for the job.
I'm sure that it's on some level a personal connection would always help in there. Now, when President Reagan appointed you, you might have been considered more conservative of an appointment, and yet many now consider you a more centrist justice. Is that a fair comment?
I really believe in states' rights, and that government should stay out of states' business as far as possible.
Okay. And what message is most important to you to impart to the children as you're visiting their classrooms?
Well, growing up as I did in a town smaller than Truckee, on a ranch that had no running water and no electricity in the early days, part of the message is that you can be anything where your dream leads you in the United States. I never dreamed I would be sitting on the Supreme Court from such beginnings. Mm-hmm. And women have a place. I now have another woman serving on the court with me. And a shirt that some friends of mine sent me soon after I was nominated to the court, there are 9 justices on the court. And it says, 1 down, 8 to go.
That's great. We just have a few minutes left, and I'd like to pull you both out of character if I can, and just speak for the few remaining minutes on the AAUW, what the mentor program is about, and what you're doing in visiting the schools, what your goals are in doing that. So, Sal Bulkley again, Lori Martin, let's talk a little bit about the American Association of University Women and what your goal is in the mentor program.
Well, I'll start. The American Association of University Women was formed to encourage women for lifelong education, really, and to provide a forum, a place where educated women could get together. Our mentor project was called New Horizons when it began in 1991. And we started it because our local group, the Truckee Donner branch, had reached such a size, and we had such a diverse membership and such talented people, we thought now is the time to take on a long-term project to give something back to the young women of Truckee. Mm-hmm. So we started with a game show called What's My Career? Like What's My Line? Mm-hmm. So that everybody could know there were women engineers, women doctors, women lawyers.
In what we call non-traditional roles, women in all sorts of jobs.
Correct.
Okay.
We went on to a career day for 7th and 8th graders,
Mm-hmm.
which we now do every other year.
Mm-hmm.
And last year we started Profiles of Women in History to celebrate National Women's History Month.
And tell me a little bit about the feedback that you've gotten from the children that you've visited. I understand you've received some letters, and tell me how it's received in the classrooms.
Would you like to talk about that, Lori?
Well, it's been great. It's really been fun. One thing, going into Safeway or just being around town, and kids will come up and go, "Hi, Elizabeth. That was really great. Votes for women," you know. And that's really fun to be recognized out of character around around town and feel that they remember those women and who
connected
they
with
were.
them. Yes.
We received great feedback through letter writing and drawings. I got great pictures of my trousers, my bloomers, and people really, young people understanding the message. And we went mostly into first through
Second through
fifth grades.
Right.
Okay.
We also spent a day in the 8th grade classes, and it was more part of a social studies project where we expanded on our characters a little bit, and I think that really helped their understanding of women's history in general.
Those are good ages to be impacting kids too, and really letting them know. It's sad to me that even in this day and age, we still have self-esteem issues with young women, and that we're still dealing with that. On the other hand, it's really nice that there are groups such as yours out there addressing that issue and going out and giving historical presentations and helping these girls see that there are more kinds of roles out there for them than just the traditional roles.
And that's a very important part of what we do, and I'd like to add that another part of the Mentor Project are groups that we're doing at Sierra Mountain Middle School for young middle school aged women to help with self-esteem, thinking about their career and their goals, and they're facilitated by both the counselor at the middle school and by an adolescent counselor.
Very briefly then, if a parent or somebody watching the program is interested in getting their child in touch with your program, would they do that through the schools?
Through the counseling program?
Through the counseling
Probably.
program at the school. So they can contact the local elementary schools
Right.
and get in touch with you that way. Thank you both for being on the show. It's just been fun. It's been great fun. Thanks, too, to our previous guests in the first segment. If you want any more information on this, you can contact the local chapter of the AAUW. And please keep an eye out for women of all kinds of accomplishment in your community. They're all around you. Thanks for joining us here on Truckee Talks.